For 9 years, a leather tannery paid Willa Pruitt a small fee to dump their scrap leather in her old barn. It was leather too warped and torn for anyone else to want. Her own family told her to haul it to the dump and just take the money, but Willa kept every single piece. Her late father, an old harness maker, left behind one saying about ruined leather. Nobody believed her, until one phone call changed everything. Willa Pruitt was 36 years old the winter her father died, and if you've ever had to keep a place running, with nothing left to run it on, stick with us tonight and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Earl Pruitt had been Larkspur's last real harness maker, a trade that had mostly disappeared from the county decades before he passed, and he left Willa the family farm, along with a stack of unpaid bills she hadn't known the full size of until the funeral was barely over. She was raising her son Sam, 6 years old at the time, mostly on her own already, and the farm itself wasn't bringing in enough to cover much beyond the basics. So when a man named Denny Wux drove out from the tannery 2 towns over and offered her a modest quarterly check just to let his company dump their scrap leather in her unused barn space, Willa said yes without thinking twice. Kestrel Leatherworks produced good, honest leather goods, but every batch left behind offcuts too warped, too small, or too irregular to sell, and disposing of it properly cost the company more than it was worth to them. Willa's empty barn solved that problem, and the quarterly check solved a piece of hers. Most people in her position would have taken the money and hauled every load straight to the county dump the same week it arrived, and for the first month or so, that's exactly what Willa intended to do. But going through her father's old workshop that same fall, looking for tools she could maybe sell to help with the bills, she found a drawer she'd never opened, tucked under his workbench, filled with scraps of his own from decades of harness work. Tacked inside the drawer, on a torn piece of cardboard, was a line in Earl's blocky handwriting that stopped her cold standing there in the cold barn. It read simply that leather doesn't die when it's cut wrong. It just waits for the right shape to come find it. Willa didn't fully understand why that line hit her the way it did, grieving and broke, and standing in her dead father's workshop. But she didn't haul that first load of tannery scrap to the dump. She sorted it instead, piece by piece, and kept every bit of it in the barn. Her sister's husband, Chip Doyle, a contractor who ran a small crew doing framing and roofing work around the county, was the first to say out loud what plenty of others in Larkspur were probably thinking privately. He came by that winter to help with some barn repairs and found the growing stacks of leather scraps, sorted by size and grain, along one whole wall, and he told Willa plainly, not unkindly, but not gently either, that she was turning her father's barn into a hoarder's mess over garbage a tannery didn't even want. Willa's sister Renee, caught between her husband's blunt opinion and her sister's grief, mostly stayed quiet on the matter, though Willa could tell Renee agreed with Chip more than she said out loud. Willa didn't argue the point with either of them. She just kept sorting every load Denny's truck brought out, quarter after quarter, year after year, while the rest of Larkspur moved on to other gossip and mostly forgot the leather was even out there. Chip brought it up again a handful of times over the following years, usually at holidays, usually the same joke about Willa running a landfill instead of a farm, and Willa usually just let it pass without much of a response, since arguing never seemed to change his mind, and she'd long since stopped needing it to. 9 years passed that way, quietly enough that even Willa herself might have called it a habit more than a plan, if you'd asked her directly. Sam grew from a 6-year-old who liked playing in the leather scraps like they were toys, into a 9-year-old who mostly ignored the barn altogether, the way kids do with things that have simply always been part of the background of home. Willa kept the farm limping along on odd jobs and the quarterly tannery checks, and some winters, when the farm work slowed down and the nights got long, she'd sit out in that barn with a few of her father's old tools, teaching herself, clumsily at first, how to actually work a piece of leather the way Earl once had. She never told anyone she was doing it. It felt, for a long while, like something private, a way of sitting with her father a little longer than his death had technically allowed. It was the spring of the 9th year, with Sam finishing up 3rd grade and the farm's finances about as thin as they'd ever been, that a certified letter arrived from the county, addressed formally to Willa Pruitt, regarding a complaint filed against her property. A neighbor, someone she'd never learned the name of for certain, had apparently called the county about the barn, describing it as an unpermitted waste storage operation, possibly a fire hazard, definitely an eyesore visible from the road. The letter named a code enforcement officer, Denise Farrow, and stated plainly that an inspection would be conducted within 30 days, after which the county would determine whether the property was in violation of local storage and waste ordinances. Willa read that letter twice at her kitchen table, Sam doing homework across from her, completely unaware that the quiet 9-year habit his mother had built in that barn was suddenly, officially, a legal problem with a 30-day clock attached to it. She sat there a long while after Sam went to bed that night, looking at the letter under the kitchen light, and thought about her father's line about leather waiting for the right shape, wondering for the first time in 9 years whether 30 days was anywhere near enough time to prove that line true, before the county made the decision for her. Denise Farrow arrived on a Tuesday morning in early April, clipboard in hand, county truck parked neatly in the drive, and she was, if anything, more measured about the whole situation than Willa had braced herself for. She walked the barn slowly, noting the stacks of sorted leather along the walls, the makeshift shelving Willa had built herself over the years, the small space cleared near the back, where Willa had quietly been teaching herself to stitch. Denise didn't lecture her, or treat her like a criminal. She explained plainly that the county had 2 paths available once a complaint like this got filed. Willa could clear the material out entirely within 30 days and close the matter, or she could formally register the operation as a legitimate small business, which would require proper storage permits, basic fire code compliance, and documentation showing the material was recognized inventory rather than unpermitted waste. Either path was legal. Only one of them let Willa keep what she'd spent 9 years building. Willa didn't sleep much that week, running numbers at the kitchen table long after Sam went to bed, trying to figure out whether registering a real business made any sense at all for a barn full of scrap leather she'd never actually sold a single piece of. But she kept coming back to her father's line, the one about leather waiting for the right shape, and some stubborn part of her wasn't ready to hand 9 years of sorting over to a dump truck just because the easier path was sitting right there in front of her. She called the county clerk's office the next morning and started the paperwork to register Pruitt Leatherworks as an official business, using her father's last name the way it felt like it was always meant to be used for something like this. Getting the barn up to code in 30 days meant more physical work than Willa could manage alone, and it was Renee, not Chip, who pushed the issue at a Sunday dinner 2 weeks in. Willa's sister told her husband plainly, in front of the whole table, that whatever he thought about the leather, Willa needed real help clearing proper walkways and building code-compliant shelving before the inspection deadline, and that mocking her from the sidelines wasn't the same as showing up with a truck full of lumber. Chip grumbled about it the way he grumbled about most things, but he showed up that following Saturday anyway, and the one after that, building shelving alongside Willa, mostly in silence, occasionally muttering something about how much material she actually had, once he started handling it directly, instead of just glancing at it from the doorway. If you've ever had family who doubted what you were building, right up until they had to help carry it themselves, we want to hear about it in the comments tonight. And we're not here to judge either side of that story, because most families have one somewhere. Denise Farrow came back for the official inspection on the 30th day, almost to the hour, walked the newly organized barn, with its labeled shelving and clear walkways, and a small fire extinguisher mounted by the door, and signed off on the property without much ceremony, noting that Pruitt Leatherworks now met every requirement for a registered home-based leather goods operation. Willa stood in her own barn afterward, officially licensed for the first time to do something she'd technically been quietly practicing in secret for years, and felt something shift in her chest that she hadn't expected, somewhere between relief and a strange, sudden responsibility to actually make something of what she'd just fought 30 days to keep. The first real order came almost by accident, the week after the inspection passed. Deacon Pike, a roofer who worked occasionally with Chip's crew, had heard through his co-workers about the belt Chip's own guys had been wearing on job sites that winter, ones Willa had made as informal favors during the slow season, and he asked outright if Willa would make him one too, offering to actually pay for it this time, instead of treating it like a family favor. Willa said yes before she'd fully thought through what accepting real money for something meant. Cut and stitched his belt over 2 careful evenings, using scrap that would have gone to the county dump 9 years earlier if she'd made a different choice that first fall, and handed it over to a genuinely satisfied customer who told 2 other roofers about it within the week. Small orders trickled in after that, mostly through word of mouth among Chip's crew and a handful of tradesmen they knew. Nothing that felt like a real business yet, more like a hobby, quietly picking up steam. Willa kept the books carefully anyway, partly out of habit from the registration process, partly because some part of her suspected, the same way she'd suspected things about her father's old note for 9 years now, that this might actually be turning into something worth tracking properly. She priced each belt modestly, barely above the cost of thread and buckles, mostly just to see whether anyone beyond a handful of favors would actually pay for something stitched by hand in an old farm barn. And every small yes that came back surprised her a little more than the one before it. She was in the barn late one evening in May, stitching a belt by lamplight for a customer she hadn't even met yet, when her phone rang with a number she recognized immediately. It was Denny Wachs, calling for the first time in months outside of his usual quarterly drop-off schedule, and something in his voice, tired and careful in a way she'd never heard from him before, told Willa this wasn't a call about scheduling before he'd even finished saying hello. "Willa," he said, "I need to talk to you about some changes at Kestrel. Things are about to look real different for both of us." Denny explained it plainly once Willa found a chair to sit down in, still holding the half-finished belt in her lap. Kestrel Leatherworks had been bought out that spring by a larger company called Ashgrove Industrial Materials, part of a wave of smaller regional tanneries getting absorbed into bigger operations, looking to consolidate supply chains across the state. Denny would be staying on for a transition period, but decisions about the scrap material, the same scrap he'd been driving out to Willa's barn for 9 years, weren't his to make anymore. A regional manager named Corbin Wexler had already flagged the arrangement during an early audit, noting that Ashgrove had contracts with industrial recyclers, willing to pay actual money for leather offcuts that Kestrel had previously just been giving away for free. Denny sounded genuinely apologetic on the phone, telling Willa he'd pushed back as hard as he could, but the decision was already essentially made above him. Corbin Wexler drove out to the Pruitt farm himself the following week, a younger man in a company polo who spoke the careful, practiced language of someone used to delivering unwelcome news efficiently. He toured the barn briefly, seemed mildly impressed by the organized shelving and the handful of finished belts hanging near Willa's workbench, and asked a few polite questions about how long she'd been doing this, though none of it seemed to change the substance of what he'd come to say. Ashgrove would be ending the free scrap arrangement in 30 days, he told her, consistent with the notice period in Kestrel's original informal agreement. And going forward, the offcuts would be sold to a recycling partner 2 counties over instead. He wasn't unkind about it, exactly. He simply treated it like the straightforward business decision it was to him, without any particular awareness that he was talking about the entire foundation of what Willa had spent 9 years building. Willa spent the better part of that 30 days doing math she didn't like the results of, no matter how she ran it. She called 3 other tanneries within a day's drive, none of which produced anything close to the quality of scrap Kestrel had, and priced out buying comparable full-grain remnants outright from leather wholesalers, numbers that would have eaten every bit of margin from her still modest belt sales and then some. She even looked into whether a smaller local cobbler or saddle shop might have similar offcuts to spare, but every lead came back the same way, either too little material or too high a price to make any of it worth the drive. She even considered, briefly and without much conviction, whether this might simply be the natural end of something that had always been built on borrowed material she'd never actually paid full price for. Her father's line kept circling back at her during those weeks, leather waiting for the right shape, and for the first time since finding that note 9 years earlier, Willa wondered if maybe this particular shape had simply run its course. Orders kept trickling in anyway during that same stretch, small and steady, mostly still through word of mouth among Chip's crew, and the handful of tradesmen Deacon Pike had told about his belt months earlier. Willa kept filling every order she could with the material still sitting on her shelves, not wanting to disappoint a single customer, while the bigger question of where her next supply would even come from sat unresolved above everything else. Chip, to his credit, had started showing up more regularly by then, not just for occasional Saturday help, but genuinely curious now about the numbers, asking Willa more than once what she planned to do about the leather situation, like it mattered to him beyond just family obligation. If you've ever had the ground shift right underneath something you'd finally started to believe in, we want to hear about it in the comments tonight, because we know exactly how that feels, and we're not finished with Willa's yet. Deacon Pike had been wearing his belt for months by then, through every kind of job site whether Larkspur's roofing season could throw at a man, and he'd taken to half-jokingly telling co-workers it was the toughest thing he owned, better than the synthetic one the company had issued him when he first started the job. On a Thursday afternoon in late June, working a steep pitch on a 2-story remodel outside town, Deacon's footing gave out on a patch of loose shingle debris, and he went down hard, catching himself against a roof bracket in a fall that could have easily been much worse than it turned out to be. His belt, loaded with tools and gear, took the brunt of the impact against the bracket's edge, the leather scraping and gouging deep, but holding completely intact, keeping his tool loop from tearing free, and sending a hammer and utility knife down onto the crew working below him. One of Deacon's co-workers had his phone out already, filming the remodel progress for a client update, and caught the whole fall and recovery, almost by accident, including Deacon's stunned laugh afterward and his immediate, half-serious declaration that this belt just saved somebody from getting hit by a falling hammer. The co-worker posted the raw, unedited clip online that same evening, mostly as a joke between friends, tagging it with nothing more than a laughing comment about Deacon's near miss and the belt that outlasted the fall. By the time Willa sat down at her kitchen table that night to go through the day's mail, still no closer to solving her supply problem with barely 2 weeks left on Corbin Wexler's 30-day clock, that video had already been shared far beyond anyone on Deacon's crew ever expected. Comment after comment, piling up from strangers, asking where they could buy a belt exactly like it, and her phone, sitting silent on the counter behind her, was about to start ringing in a way it never had before. Willa's phone started ringing before 7 the next morning, and it didn't stop in any meaningful way for the better part of a week. Deacon's video had been picked up overnight by a couple of accounts that shared workplace safety clips and job site moments, racking up views far beyond anything anyone involved had anticipated, and buried in nearly every comment section was some version of the same question. Where could people actually buy a belt like that? Willa's small informal setup, built for filling maybe 2 or 3 orders a week between farm chores, was suddenly staring down message requests and phone calls numbering in the dozens, then the hundreds, all in the space of a few days. She did the only thing that made sense in the moment, which was call Chip directly and ask, without pride getting in the way of it, whether he and his crew could help her figure out how to actually fulfill what was coming in. Chip showed up within the hour, and for the first time since that first winter, when he'd called her barn a hoarder's mess, he looked at the shelves of sorted leather like they were something worth taking seriously, rather than something worth mocking. He and Renee both came out that weekend, helping Willa set up a proper order system, answering messages, sorting incoming requests by size and style, treating the whole operation with a seriousness neither of them had shown it in the 9 years leading up to that point. Corbin Wexler called again that same week, and this time his tone had changed considerably from their first meeting in the barn. Ashgrove's corporate team had apparently noticed the sudden spike in attention around Pruitt Leatherworks, tracing it back, with some surprise, to the same scrap material they'd been planning to sell off to industrial recyclers for a fraction of what it was clearly now worth to the right buyer. Corbin asked, more carefully this time, whether Willa might be interested in discussing a different kind of arrangement than the one he'd originally come out to end. Willa didn't let herself get pushed around in that conversation the way she might have 30 days earlier, back when losing the deal outright had felt like the end of everything. She'd spent that stretch learning her own numbers well enough by then to know exactly what the scrap material was actually worth to her business, down to the cost of every buckle and spool of thread she'd priced out during those anxious weeks searching for alternatives. Instead of accepting whatever terms Ashgrove offered first, she proposed her own arrangement, an exclusive multi-year supply contract, guaranteed volume, a fixed price, locked in well below what any recycler would pay, in exchange for Ashgrove being able to say, honestly and publicly, that their offcuts were the foundation of a small business getting real national attention. Corbin took the proposal back to his team, and within 2 weeks, Willa had a signed contract sitting on her kitchen table that secured her supply for the next 5 years. The following months moved faster than Willa had time to properly absorb. Orders that had once trickled in one at a time now came in batches, and what had been a one-woman operation stitching belts by lamplight became, out of pure necessity, something closer to a small workshop. With Chip managing production logistics, Renee handling the growing customer messages, and Willa training 2 local part-timers on the stitching techniques she'd spent 9 years teaching herself from her father's old tools. Sam, 11 now, took to hanging around the barn most afternoons after school, sorting scrap, the same way his mother once had, the same way his grandfather apparently had, decades before either of them. It was Chip, of all people, who brought up Earl's line first. Standing in the barn one evening, surrounded by more finished product than any of them could have imagined, sitting there the winter, he'd first called it a hoarder's mess. He asked Willa, half joking but not entirely, whether her father had somehow known this was coming when he wrote that note about leather waiting for the right shape. Willa didn't have a real answer for that, not one she could put into words that made complete sense even to herself. But standing there in a barn that had gone from unpermitted waste complaint to a business now approaching $500,000 in annual revenue inside a single year, she figured her father had probably known something, even if he couldn't have named exactly what shape it would eventually take. Pruitt Leatherworks crossed $500,000 in its first full year of real operation that following spring, a number that would have sounded impossible to Willa, standing in that barn 9 years earlier, sorting her first load of scrap alone, while her family quietly wondered if grief had gotten the better of her judgment. Chip apologized to her properly that same spring, plainly and without much fuss, the way men like him tend to apologize when they mean it. Denise Farrow, the code enforcement officer who'd started the whole 30-day scramble, still stopped by occasionally just to see how the place had turned out, telling Willa once that it was the best outcome she'd seen come out of a neighbor complaint in her entire career with the county. Willa still keeps her father's old note, the original scrap of cardboard, framed now above her workbench where Sam can see it every afternoon he spends out there with her. She thinks of Earl every single time a new order comes in for something built from a piece of leather somebody else had already written off as ruined. If this story reminded you that the things everyone else calls garbage sometimes just haven't found their shape yet, stay with us and subscribe, because we've got more stories like Willa and Earl's about the things nobody believed in until somebody finally did.